All right, strap in, everyone, because today we are taking a deep dive into something called the Border Act of 2024.
Oh, yeah. This one is a big one.
That's a big plan, right? To handle everything happening down at the U.S. border,
You got it.
especially with security and the whole fentanyl situation, right?
Yeah, it's officially Senate Bill 4361.
4361, okay.
And it's actually a pretty fascinating read.
Fascinating. How so?
Well, imagine it like a two-part play.
A two-part play, okay?
Yeah, you've got Division A, which is like throwing money at the problem right now.
Got it.
And then Division B, which is like trying to change the rules of the game.
Okay, so like dealing with the immediate chaos and then trying to prevent future chaos.
Exactly. And Division A is all about that immediate action.
Okay.
You know, using what are called emergency supplemental appropriation.
Emergency supplementals,
They even label it an emergency requirement.
which I imagine in the U.S. system, that carries a lot of weight.
It does, yeah.
So where's all this emergency money going?
Yeah.
I'm seeing names like Customs and Border Protection,
Right.
the DEA, even the FBI.
Yeah.
I didn't expect the FBI to be Border Patrol.
Well, they're not literally patrolling the border.
Okay,
But the fentanyl crisis is a big part of this bill.
right.
And the FBI is actually getting funds to analyze DNA samples specifically from migrants.
Okay.
It seems like they're trying to build a database to track where the fentanyl is coming from.
Sort of like a forensic investigation, but for drugs?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Connecting it to specific people or groups.
Got it.
And then there's this other thing that's getting a bunch of money called alternatives to detention.
Alternatives to detention.
Yeah.
What is that?
That's a great question, and it kind of highlights how complex our immigration system is.
Okay.
So imagine someone's caught crossing the border without permission, or is maybe facing deportation, right?
Mhm.
They could be detained, held in a facility. Alternatives to detention are these programs that allow them to be released
Okay.
while their case is sorted out.
So instead of being locked up, maybe they'll have an ankle monitor or have to check in regularly.
Precisely.
Okay.
And this bill is putting serious cash towards expanding these programs.
Interesting. So there seems to be a real push away from traditional detention then.
There is,
Okay.
which can be expensive and frankly quite controversial.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's also a lot of talk in here about technology, specifically using AI for what they're calling non-intrusive inspections.
Right.
Is that like the scanners we see at airports, but on steroids?
It's a similar concept, but way more sophisticated.
Okay.
Imagine AI analyzing scans of cargo and vehicles.
Right.
Flagging anything suspicious without a human even needing to be there.
Okay, so like automating that first layer.
Right.
Okay.
And the bill even says that they want to get this tech through open competition.
Open competition, what does that mean?
Meaning they're looking for the best option. They're not just sticking with, you know, the usual companies.
So making sure they're getting the best bang for their buck.
Exactly.
Right.
And one more thing that stood out to me in this section is that they actually rescinded some funds previously allocated for other things.
Rescinded, what does that mean?
Basically, they're taking money away from some programs to free up cash for this border situation.
So robbing Peter to pay Paul, but on a government scale.
Yeah, you could say that.
That's pretty bold.
It is. It highlights the urgency they're trying to convey with this whole thing.
Right.
But now let's switch gears and head over to Division B, which is all about changing the rules of the game.
Okay.
This part's actually called the Border Act within the larger bill,
Okay.
and it proposes a whole bunch of changes to how the U.S. handles immigration and asylum cases.
Okay, so less about firefighting and more about preventing future fires.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
And I see a lot of talking here about capacity building.
Capacity building, does that mean they're building bigger detention centers?
Not quite.
Okay.
Capacity building here means strengthening the agencies that deal with immigration cases.
So like USCIS, IC, those sorts of agencies.
Exactly, like USCIS and IC.
Okay.
And they're trying to make them bigger, faster, more efficient.
I'm all for efficiency, especially when it comes to something as important as immigration.
Right.
How do they plan on doing that?
Well, the bill gives these agencies something called direct hire authority,
Direct hire authority, what is that?
which basically lets them skip some of the usual federal hiring steps,
Okay.
which can often be very slow
Right.
to fill positions more quickly.
So they're trying to cut through red tape to bring in reinforcements.
Precisely.
Okay.
They're even waiving restrictions on rehiring retirees,
Really?
which tells you they're really desperate for experienced people.
Wow. Okay.
It's not just about quantity, though. They're
Yeah.
also trying to improve the quality, especially when it comes to asylum officers.
asylum officers, right? These are the folks who are conducting those initial interviews with people
Exactly.
to determine if they have that credible fear of persecution.
You got it.
Okay.
It's a tough job. There's a massive backlog of cases.
Right.
And so the bill even includes a special pay rate just for these officers,
Okay.
acknowledging how demanding and important that role is.
Trying to attract and retain good people. Makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
But I also noticed in here something about background checks.
Right.
Are they changing the requirements for who they hire?
This is where things get a little tricky.
Okay.
The bill allows the government to waive certain background checks in certain situations.
So like if they're desperate to get people in the door, they don't have to be as strict.
It doesn't say exactly why they might do this, but it's bound to raise eyebrows on both sides.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, on one hand, you want to make sure you're hiring qualified and trustworthy people.
Right, especially for sensitive positions like that.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, if you need people, you need people.
That's right.
So it's a tough balancing act.
It is, yeah.
Okay, so we've got faster hiring, more money for asylum officers.
Right.
It seems like they're really trying to beef up that part of the system.
They are.
Didn't we also see a lot of money going toward those alternatives to detention programs?
Yes.
What's the connection there?
Well, if we zoom out a bit, we can see how all these pieces kind of fit together.
Okay.
Remember, the goal is to move away from detaining people while they wait for their cases to be resolved.
Right.
These alternatives to detention, like ankle monitors and regular check-ins, are seen as this more humane and cost-effective way to manage this population.
But aren't these programs a bit controversial?
They are.
Okay.
Some argue that they don't do enough to ensure people show up for their court dates.
Right.
And that they can even be intrusive and even dehumanizing
Right.
for the individuals involved.
That sounds like another one of those balancing acts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Trying to find a solution that works for everyone, or at least minimizes harm, right?
Yeah. Right. Right.
But this bill doesn't stop there.
Oh, no.
There's a whole section about streamlining the actual asylum process.
Okay, so we've streamlined hiring. Now we're streamlining the process itself.
That's right.
Okay, and this is where things get really interesting
They do.
because they're proposing something called, and I'm just going to read this straight out, provisional non-custodial removal proceedings.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. I know.
I need a translator.
Think of it as a new, faster lane on the asylum highway,
Okay, faster lane.
specifically for people who arrive at the border by land and express a fear of persecution or torture.
Okay.
They would be released under supervision while they await a quicker decision on their asylum claim.
Quicker decision, so faster processing.
Yes,
That sounds good in theory.
potentially, but it also begs the question,
Oh,
does faster necessarily mean fairer?
right.
Could it lead to cases being rushed?
People not having enough time to prepare,
Exactly.
and ultimately deserving individuals being wrongly denied asylum.
Yeah, that's the concern.
So are these provisional proceedings for everyone seeking asylum, or is there another track?
There is indeed another track, which the bill calls protection merits removal proceedings.
Protection merits removal proceedings.
This would apply to other asylum seekers, those who maybe don't fit the criteria for the faster lane.
Okay.
It's also designed to streamline things,
Streamline things. Okay.
but it introduces stricter requirements for those seeking protection.
So two different paths for asylum seekers, both with the aim of speeding things up, but with potential downsides as well.
Exactly.
Okay.
What happens if someone decides they don't even want to go through this whole process?
Right.
Well, the bill encourages something called voluntary repatriation,
Voluntary repatriation. Okay.
which is basically choosing to return to your home country.
Okay.
They're offering some incentives for this,
Oh,
but
okay.
it raises concerns about whether people are truly making a free and informed choice.
Right. Are they really going voluntarily, or are they being coerced?
Exactly, or if they're being pressured to return to potentially dangerous situations.
Right. That's heavy stuff.
It is.
Okay. So we've got these two new paths
Right,
and the option to voluntarily go back.
right.
Are there any other big changes to the process that we should be aware of?
There's one more that deserves special attention.
Okay, hit me with it.
It's called the Border Emergency Authority.
The Border Emergency Authority.
This provision would allow the government to bypass certain normal procedures
Okay.
under specific conditions.
So what kind of conditions would trigger this emergency authority?
Essentially, if the number of migrants crossing the border hits a certain threshold,
Okay.
the government can flip the switch.
Flip the switch.
And this would allow them to implement stricter border controls,
Okay.
speed up deportations,
Right.
and potentially even limit access to asylum.
Limit access to asylum. So this is where it gets really controversial.
It is incredibly controversial.
Like-
Critics argue that this provision gives the government far too much power and could lead to human rights violations.
Right.
They're worried it'll be used to unfairly target certain groups and deny people their right to due process.
So potentially a tool for good, but also a potential weapon for harm.
Exactly.
Okay, so we haven't even talked about the Afghan allies that we promised to help.
Right.
Are they addressed in this bill at all?
They are.
Okay.
The bill does include provisions aimed at fulfilling those promises.
Okay, good.
It outlines a path for them to receive special immigrant visas
Right.
and access refugee processing,
Okay.
both for those still in Afghanistan and those who have already made it to other countries.
That sounds like a step in the right direction.
It is.
But are there any potential challenges with these efforts?
Of course, there are always logistical hurdles, the ongoing danger for those still in Afghanistan,
Right.
and concerns that the bill doesn't do enough to address the backlog of cases.
Right, because we've heard stories about these folks waiting years and years and years.
Exactly, and the bureaucratic delays that have plagued the special immigrant visa program for years.
So even with good intentions, actually getting those folks to safety is still a massive challenge.
It is a massive challenge.
Okay, is there anything else in this rule-changing section before we move on?
One last thing.
Okay.
They're proposing a protection appellate board.
Protection Appellate Board, and what does that do?
This would change the appeals process for those seeking asylum or other forms of protection in the U.S.
So a new layer of bureaucracy.
In a sense, yeah.
What's the point of this board?
It's supposed to create a more centralized and specialized system for handling appeals,
Look.
aiming for more efficiency and consistency.
Okay.
But it's too early to say how it'll work in practice.
Right, so we've got faster hiring, streamlined asylum processes, more power for the government in emergencies, and a whole new appeals process.
That's right.
It's like they're trying to rebuild the engine while the car is still running.
It's definitely a complex undertaking, with a lot of moving parts and potential for unintended consequences.
Yeah, a lot to unpack here.
There is.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Border Act of 2024.
Yeah, good to be back.
We just finished kind of unpacking the bill itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now it's time to sort of zoom out, I guess, and talk about what it all means.
Right.
You know, the real world impact
Yeah.
of all these changes.
Yeah, it's crucial to remember that laws aren't just words on paper.
Right.
They have this ripple effect, impacting real people and shaping how our country operates.
It's like throwing a stone into a pond.
Yeah.
You get that initial splash, but then there are all these expanding circles of impact.
Exactly.
So let's start with the people at the center of all of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Migrants and asylum seekers.
Right.
How would this bill actually affect their lives?
It's kind of a mixed bag, to be honest.
Mixed bag, how so?
Some aspects could make things easier, especially for certain groups.
Okay.
For instance, expanding those alternatives to detention programs could mean fewer people stuck in detention centers.
Right.
Which is definitely a positive step.
I would imagine so.
And those streamlined asylum processes, while controversial, could lead to quicker decisions for some, meaning less time spent in that agonizing uncertainty.
But you said for some.
Right.
Does that mean others might actually be worse off under this bill?
There's definitely that risk.
Okay.
That new, faster asylum track, the provisional non-custodial removal proceedings we talked about,
Right.
could end up backfiring.
How so?
If cases are rushed through, some asylum seekers might not have enough time to prepare or present their claims properly.
So it's like prioritizing speed over thoroughness,
Exactly.
which doesn't sound like a good recipe for justice.
Yeah, it's a trade-off we need to examine very closely.
Right.
Will these faster processes truly be fair and just, or will they end up hurting the very people they're supposed to help?
Yeah, that's a scary thought.
It is.
And then you've got that border emergency authority looming in the background,
Right.
which could be used to drastically limit access to asylum and speed up deportations, potentially sending people back to really dangerous situations.
Absolutely. That's a huge concern.
So it's like we're trying to balance efficiency with humanity, and it's just not an easy equation to solve.
That's a tough one for sure.
What about the Afghan allies we discussed earlier?
Yeah.
Would this bill actually make a difference in getting them to safety?
Well, the provisions for Afghan allies are well-intentioned.
Okay.
but there's a lot of skepticism
Skepticism
based on past experiences.
Okay.
The special immigrant visa program has been plagued with problems for years.
Right.
And it's unclear if this bill does enough to address those underlying issues.
So even if the bill passes, those bureaucratic delays and backlogs could still make it incredibly difficult for those who risk their lives for us to actually reach safety here.
Yeah, that's a very real concern.
That's really sad.
And even if they do make it to the U.S.,
Right.
the challenges don't disappear.
Of course not.
Many of these individuals will need significant support to rebuild their lives.
Right. Learning the language, finding housing and jobs, dealing with the trauma they may have experienced.
Absolutely.
It's not just about getting them here.
Right.
It's about ensuring they have the resources to actually thrive and become contributing members of our society.
I think we owe them more than just a ticket to safety.
Yeah.
We owe them a chance at a new life, a real opportunity to heal and build a future.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've talked about the impact on individuals, but what about the bigger picture?
Right.
How would this bill affect the overall U.S. immigration system?
That's a good question.
One of the most significant potential impacts is the shift in power dynamics.
Okay, how so?
This bill could give the executive branch, particularly the Department of Homeland Security, more control over immigration policy and enforcement.
So potentially less oversight from Congress and less transparency for the public.
That's the worry for a lot of critics.
Okay.
They argue it could lead to a more authoritarian approach to immigration, with fewer checks and balances to prevent abuses of power.
That's a concerning thought.
It is, yeah.
It feels like we're constantly trying to find that sweet spot between security and freedom, and this bill seems to really tip the scales towards security.
I think that's a fair assessment.
What about the emphasis on technology?
Right.
We talked about AI and those high-tech inspections. How might those shape the future of border security?
Well, technology is undoubtedly going to play a larger role in how we manage our borders in the years to come.
Right.
On one hand, AI and other advanced technologies could help improve efficiency, reduce costs, and perhaps even make the process more objective.
So less reliance on human judgment, which can be subjective and prone to bias.
Potentially, but it also raises some serious ethical concerns.
Like what?
Can we ensure that these algorithms are fair and unbiased?
Right.
What happens when we delegate life-altering decisions to machines?
Yeah.
There are no easy answers there.
It sounds like another one of those double-edged swords.
It really is.
Technology can be a powerful tool, but it's how we wield it that determines whether it's used for good or for ill.
Exactly.
We keep coming back to this theme of balance, right?
Yeah.
Security versus freedom, efficiency versus fairness, technology versus human judgment. It seems like those are the fundamental tensions at the heart of this bill and at the heart of the immigration debate as a whole.
You hit the nail on the head.
And how we navigate these tensions will have a profound impact, not just on the U.S. immigration system, but on our nation's identity and our place in the world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
And while we're focused on the U.S. right now, it's important to remember this isn't just an American issue.
Of course not.
Right. Immigration is a global phenomenon.
Absolutely.
And the challenges we're facing here are mirrored in many other parts of the world.
Absolutely. What's happening at the U.S. border is part of a much larger story.
So, while this bill is focused on the U.S.-Mexico border, we need to zoom out even further and look at the global forces that are driving people to leave their homes and seek new lives elsewhere.
We do.
That's a whole other deep dive, isn't it?
It certainly is.
And it's one we'll explore in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
We'll examine the historical and global context of migration, the challenges and opportunities it presents, and what it all means for the future of our interconnected world.
Well, listeners, get ready for an even deeper dive.
That's right.
We're about to go global. Okay, we're back, and time to really widen our perspective here.
Yeah, the big picture.
We've been laser focused on this Border Act of 2024.
Right.
But now we need to zoom out.
Zoom out.
And look at immigration through a global lens.
Yeah, it's like we've been examining a single tree, and now we're going to step back and appreciate the whole forest.
Right.
What's happening at the U.S. border is just one piece of a much larger...
Like a ripple in a pond, but the pond is the entire world.
Exactly.
So what are some of the big forces that are driving this global wave of migration?
Well, it's a mix of factors, and they're all interconnected. We're talking about poverty, lack of opportunity, political instability, violence, persecution.
Right.
The list goes on.
Yeah.
And Increasingly, climate change is becoming a major driver of displacement.
Climate change, that's not something you hear every day in the context of immigration.
Right.
How does that play into it?
As the effects of climate change intensify,
Right.
we're seeing more and more people forced to leave their homes.
Okay.
Due to things like droughts, floods, rising sea levels,
Right.
situations where their homes are literally becoming uninhabitable.
So it's not just about seeking a better life, it's about survival at that point.
It is. It's about finding a place where you can literally live.
Wow.
And the scale of this movement is staggering.
Yeah.
According to the UN, there are over 300 million international migrants in the world today.
300 million, that's like the entire population of the U.S.
That's right, on the move.
That's mind-boggling.
It is.
It really puts things into perspective.
It does.
So how are countries around the world dealing with this influx of people?
There's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Okay.
Some countries, like Canada and Germany, have adopted more welcoming policies,
Okay.
recognizing the economic and social benefits that immigrants can bring.
But it feels like those are the exceptions, right?
Yeah.
It seems like most countries are tightening their borders, becoming more restrictive.
Unfortunately, you're right.
Oh.
Fear and anxiety about immigration, often fueled by nationalist and populist movements,
Right.
are leading many countries to adopt stricter border controls, limit access to asylum,
Right.
make it harder for migrants to integrate.
It's kind of a paradox, isn't it?
It is.
We have this global trend of people being forced to migrate,
Right.
and at the same time, we're making it harder for them to find safety and build new lives.
Yeah, it's a recipe for tragedy,
Yeah.
and we're seeing the consequences play out in real time. In the Mediterranean Sea, where desperate migrants risk their lives on overcrowded boats,
Right.
and at the U.S.-Mexico border, where people are dying trying to cross harsh terrain.
It's a sobering reminder that these aren't just abstract policy debates.
No.
These are real people's lives at stake.
That's right.
So where does this Border Act of 2024 that we've been analyzing fit into this global picture?
It reflects a trend we're seeing in many parts of the world.
Okay.
A shift towards stricter border controls and a more enforcement-heavy approach to immigration.
Oh.
It's a response to the pressures of global migration, but it also raises questions about whether this is the most effective or humane way to address the issue.
Because building walls and deploying more Border Patrol agents might address the symptoms,
Right.
but it doesn't address the root causes of migration.
Exactly. And critics argue that these restrictive policies are not only ineffective, but also inhumane.
Okay.
They drive migration underground, making it more dangerous for those involved, and they can have devastating consequences for individuals and families who are simply trying to survive.
So if stricter borders and more enforcement aren't the answer, what are the alternatives?
Right.
What can be done to address this global challenge in a way that's both effective and humane?
Well, there's a growing recognition that we need more comprehensive and collaborative approaches.
Okay, what does that look like?
This means addressing the root causes of migration.
So poverty, conflict, climate change, all that.
Exactly. Poverty, conflict, climate change,
Oh, okay.
and creating safer and more legal pathways for people to migrate.
Right.
It also means investing in integration programs and fostering a more welcoming and inclusive environment for newcomers.
So it's about shifting our perspective from seeing migration as a problem to be solved
Right.
to seeing it as this complex human phenomenon
Yeah,
that requires understanding and compassion and long-term solutions.
well said.
It's about recognizing that migration has always been a part of human history,
Yeah, it has.
and that when managed effectively, it can benefit both sending and receiving countries.
Absolutely.
It's about finding that balance
Right.
between security and compassion, between national interests and global responsibilities.
It's a tall order, but it's a challenge we must face head on.
And it requires us to engage in these difficult conversations,
Absolutely.
to learn from each other, and to work together to find solutions
Right.
that uphold human dignity and promote a more just and equitable world.
I think that's a great note to end on.
It is. Well, listeners, that brings our deep dive into the Border Act of 2024 to a close.